But I would not go so far as to say these plays are so problematic, so dated, so narrow, so Eurocentric that they have nothing to offer us anymore. I think that's wrong. And I think it's specifically about some of the things Shakespeare was good at. He was really good at showing people at moments when they change their mind or when they recognize something, including injustice and inequity. He's just really good at that.
Michael Witmore is the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., a truly special institution in that it both facilitates great scholarship and facilitates genuine public engagement. During his tenure, the Folger has undertaken numerous public-facing humanities projects. To name just a few of these ventures, and I encourage you to please whip out a pen and jot these down to look up after the talk. These include Folger Digital Texts, which is a free and searchable database of Shakespeare's plays and poems. Shakespeare Documented, an open access collection of primary source documents relating to Shakespeare's life, and the podcast series Shakespeare Unlimited. Today, Witmore is at the forefront of a growing effort to use big data analysis to approach the works of Shakespeare and his contemporaries at an unprecedented scale. He is currently co-editing the series Art and Shakespeare Studies in Language and Digital Methodologies and co-authoring a book on Shakespeare and digital interpretation, as well as a monograph on early modern wisdom literature. Please join me in welcoming Michael Witmore to Boston College.
Let me begin by inviting you to come and visit us at the Folger, which, as you'll hear in my remarks, is 2 blocks east of the United States Capitol, beautifully housed in an Art Deco building with a Tudor interior. So it is the only Greco-Deco Tudor building, I think, in the country, but I do invite you to come and visit us. Today, though, my talk is about Civic Shakespeare. As you may remember, Alexis de Tocqueville visited America in the early 18th century, and he saw Shakespeare's plays in settler homes. He says, "There is hardly a pioneer's hut that doesn't contain a few odd volumes of Shakespeare." And he notes that few Americans really had time to appreciate the subtleties of his stories. But he was intrigued by the fact that Shakespeare was part of the furnishings of an emerging republic, even if those works were read only for diversion. Looking back now on over 3 centuries of post-settlement history, it's clear that American political life and Shakespeare's life, afterlife, remain intertwined. So we know, for example, that Thomas Jefferson recommended reading the plays between the hours of 6 and 8:30, I think. After an afternoon of reading history and philosophy, he recommended reading the plays so that students and future leaders would learn the power of language. We know, too, that John Adams read and reread the history plays for lessons on how ambition leads to civil discord. Growing up in the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln rehearsed speeches from Shakespeare's characters, and as U.S. president, meditated on the stories of Macbeth and Richard III during the most difficult days of the American Civil War. Like other leaders in this period, he would find in these plays vivid examples of the ways in which the human personality, most proud when injured and rivalrous beyond any practical need, threatens the political order around them. Frederick Douglass, whose eloquence made him the most famous orator of the 19th century, recalled lines from Hamlet when describing his decision to flee enslavement in 1835, noting that in making this difficult decision, someone in his position would rather bear those ills we had than fly to others we know not of. Whether it was for models of persuasion or warnings about human foibles and the ironies of history, Shakespeare was a chronicler of characters and passions that American political thinkers consulted from the earliest days. The use of Shakespeare to diagnose human foibles and thus to speculate on our ability to live together in political association continues to this day. Witness, for example, the success of Stephen Greenblatt's recent book, Tyrant, which presents characters such as Richard III, Coriolanus, and Jack Cade as case studies in the authoritarian personality and its culture of enablers. But Shakespeare's work also describes an early modern European world that, during the poet's lifetime, came into contact with an America that had no Americans. We can't say whether the settlers of Jamestown and Plymouth brought with them the printed texts of Shakespeare when they arrived in 1607 and 1620, and most likely they did not. But their presence in North America was shaped by the historical developments that Shakespeare was reacting to in his plays: fractures in religious life, early colonization, tensions around monarchical privilege and royal taxation, fears of population movement, and anxieties about the rise of an independent merchant class. These forces are chronicled not only in the plays, but in the literature that surrounds them, works that are drawn from political and religious history, blasts from popular culture, troves of family records, almanacs, and, of course, works of fiction, music, and poetry. A documentary picture of these early modern developments would itself constitute an archive for democratic thinking, if only as a window onto the tensions and the examples that shaped the views of America's earliest colonists and succeeding political theorists. Such an archive does exist, and it ended up on Capitol Hill, housed in the Folger Shakespeare Memorial Library. The Folger is home to a large and growing collection of research materials that supply our knowledge of Shakespeare and of the early modern world in which he lived. But the story of how an English poet came to be memorialized in a city of politics is part of my talk today, a story that begins, in most tellings, on April 23rd, 1932, which is the day when the Folger opened in a ceremony that was intended by the President of the United States and the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I'll discuss that ceremony in a moment. But first, I want to reflect on an encounter that occurred just over 300 years earlier in the year 1623, when a Kentish captain named Henry Fleet traveled up the Anacostia River from the Jamestown settlement and was taken prisoner by a native people known as the Nacotchtank. The Nacotchtank lived in the area that is now Washington, D.C., something we know from archaeology, which shows us that they were growing food crops just east of the U.S. Capitol. This is the area that is now occupied by the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Folger. In 1623, then, the same year that Hemmings and Condell were overseeing the production and publication of Shakespeare's first folio in London, an Englishman who had perhaps once glimpsed the Globe Theatre was captured by a native people who lived in a district that was to become the seat of the world's most powerful representative democracy. Fleet was ransomed about 5 years later, and he returned to London to write an account of his captivity. Fast forward now to the day on which the Folger opens its doors in 1932, an event that was captured in print, in photography, and broadcast locally over a relatively new technology called the radio. On former fields of squash, corn, and beans then, there now stood a marble neoclassical building containing thousands of rare books and manuscripts, including maps and other records of the encounters that took place on the Potomac and Anacostia rivers 3 centuries earlier. Those two histories, one buried in the ground, the other buried in the Folger stacks, are only now coming together as we research the history of this site, but they will come together in another important frame for thinking about civic life on Capitol Hill, particularly its native and colonial antecedents. Shakespeare's stories about power often illustrate the churn of history, the way in which one set of action gives rise to another set of outcomes that no one could have foreseen. No one could have known that the Folger Shakespeare Library would have ended up standing on farming grounds of a party to this 1623 conflict, or that 82 copies of one of the world's most famous and most studied books, one that opens with the colonial tale of the Tempest, would leave Isaac Jaggert's shop in London only to arrive centuries later on that very spot. There's abundant evidence that the Folger's form and location were intended to make a deliberate statement about the role of history, poetry, and literature in democratic life. And in the time that remains, I'd like to explore how the founding of the Folger in 1932 and its later history provides insights into the larger question of how literature and the humanities support the practice of liberal democracy. This is no small subject, and I don't pretend to be an expert in political theory, civics, or the law, but during my time as the 7th director of the Folger, working in Washington in a moment of enormous stress on the political norms and our governing institutions, I'm reminded daily of the complexity of Shakespeare's presence in American life, just from looking across the street at the drama of what happens on the Senate and the House floors. I've also learned to appreciate the continuing ironies of history, particularly when individuals try to predict the trajectories of the institutions they lead. To the opening. The build-up to the opening was full of drama, a drama that was magnified by the secretiveness of the Folger's collecting. By 1928, it was clear that Mr. and Mrs. Folger had an asset of enormous value, which they planned to pass along as, in their words, a gift to the American people. At that time, the press estimated that the number of volumes in the collection was around 20,000, although in the time it would become clear that the number was significantly greater, almost 80,000 when the Folger opened its doors. The physical size of the collection may have been unknown even to Mr. and Mrs. Folger, who had arranged for it to be stored in separate fireproof vaults in New York in the years of their relatively secretive collection building. The story of the creation of such a collection is complex, and on the study on this particular topic, I'd recommend to you Stephen Grant's biography of the Folgers. But briefly, I think its existence can be credited to three things. The first was that when Henry Folger was an undergraduate at Amherst College, he attended a lecture by Ralph Waldo Emerson and was inspired by that lecture to read Emerson's essays, including essays about Shakespeare, which led to his lifelong love of Shakespeare. The second is that he was president of Standard Oil, and the Standard Oil monopoly was capable of generating significant cash, and by borrowing against his paycheck, he was able to quietly acquire items with a network of factors who went around the world acquiring Shakespearean treasures. And the third factor that I think is critical is that he married a woman named Emily Jordan Folger, who had a master's degree from Vassar in the sources of Shakespeare's plays. And what she knew was that there is not agreement about what the words are in those separate sources for the plays, and that only by comparing them could we understand what the final copies of books like the First Folio would have looked like. It's also good that she convinced him to collect books, because if he'd chosen to collect art, he could have never competed with John Rockefeller, and we probably wouldn't be here. I certainly wouldn't, talking about Shakespeare. The Folgers would have to reveal the scope of their collecting when a conflict developed around the point that they chose for their new building to house the collection. In 1928, the Congress was contemplating an act that would have essentially nationalized a parcel of property just east of the Jefferson Building. Mr. Folger learned of this, and knowing that he had already purchased that stretch of land for his library, wrote immediately to the Librarian of Congress. And so from this plot, you can see a drawing around 1928 of the U.S. Capitol. Just to the east of it is a square complex building that is the Jefferson Library. And just to the east of that, to the right, is a small darker yellow building, which is the Folger Shakespeare Library. That whole block was going to be taken over for an annex to the Library of Congress. And you'll notice that the parcel just above the Jefferson Building is labeled the future. It is actually the future Supreme Court of the United States. So when he learned of that, he wrote to the Librarian of Congress named Putnam, and to George Putnam he said, I have a collection of inestimable value that the government of the United States could not afford to acquire. And this is in the Depression. He said, it's my intention to make a gift of this to the nation because he believed, quote, in the extraordinary promise of what the national capital and Capitol Hill may become as a center for cultural studies. This is really an extraordinary linkage between the idea of Shakespeare and something that should be remembered civically, and probably one of the most important clues we have, and I'll just show you a few more slides. This is a detail from a map in our collection of the Potomac people along the Anacostia River, and it was in this area that the U.S. Capitol would eventually be built, and this is the area where Fleet was attacked and captured. This is the Librarian of Congress, George Putnam, and the telegram he wrote to Mr. Folger saying, "I've received your note. It is of urgent importance. I want to talk to you right away." And here on the left, Henry Folger and Emily Folger, and on the right, their architect. One of the things that happened when they hired Paul Cray, who was a Beaux-Arts architect from France, was they were hiring an architect who actually had experience with memorial architecture. Cray had designed several war memorials in France, and had also designed the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Organization of American States building in Washington. In the process of designing the building, we do have the correspondence between the Folgers and Cray, and one of the issues that comes up was the uncertainty about what to name their institution. Cray drew 7 beautiful elevations of the front facade, which Congress noted would save the United States federal government $180,000 because Mr. Folger would take over the obligation of creating a stately frontage to East Capitol as it approaches the Congress. The Folgers had a hard time figuring out what to name their institution. And on these drawings, we see a variety of names. Here you see the Folger Shakespeare Foundation. In another one of the drawings, it says the Folger Shakespeare Memorial. But in the end, Folger told his architect, "I want to call it the Folger Shakespeare Library because in the end, it is a library." Of course, it's also much more. If you look at what else was included in this building, and here's a picture of the Folger being erected on the north side of that parcel, it included a room that actually will remind you of a room like this, which was a long gallery in Great Hall, a Renaissance reading room, and then the first permanent Shakespeare theater to be built in North America. The inclusion of these 3 features tells us that the institution was designed to encompass research, public education, and performance, and in effect, it would be a national platform for the liberal and performing arts, starting with Shakespeare. There's also a series of bookish gestures which I think were directed specifically by Folger, and it played upon a sense which is often expressed in lyric poetry, that the poetry itself is one of the greatest monuments to a love or to a life. So in Sonnet 81, Shakespeare writes, "Your monument," this is to the beloved, "your monument shall be my gentle verse, which eyes not yet created shall overread." And so Mr. Folger instructed Paul Cray to design a set of quotations from the first folio, mimicking exactly the book's spelling, including this quotation from Ben Jonson on the east facade. This was the first typeface Cray designed, which is an Art Deco typeface, and it's one he abandoned. But the inscription reads, "Thou art a monument without a tomb, and art alive still while thy book doth live, and we have the wits to read and praise to give." So Jonson, in writing this in the first folio, was saying not only that Shakespeare was a powerful writer, but that the greatest monument to Shakespeare would be the book that carried his words. That book, the first folio, printed in 1623, which collects together 36 Shakespeare plays, is itself housed in the Folger Shakespeare Library, which is a living memorial to Shakespeare. So, in a way, Folger was building a memorial within a memorial. This type of bookish gesture was really aimed, I think, at people who knew Shakespeare. It was more of a nod at a Renaissance poetic conceit than a statement for broad public consumption. The word memorial is also used, however, in virtually every description of the Folger project in local newspapers and in remarks made by the early Folger staff. Here we see a much bolder equation of Shakespeare with the American founders, one that would, I think, strike us today as overblown if it were made. The first librarian of the Folger, William A. Slade, delivered a funeral oration for Henry Folger after Henry died in 1930 of unexpected complications from surgery. So Henry Folger dies 2 years before the building is finished. And in his remarks, Slade says, "A line drawn from the Folger Shakespeare Memorial through the Capitol building and extending onward will all but touch the monument to Washington and the memorial to Lincoln, the two Americans whose light also spreads across the world." That sentiment is again expressed in news accounts that celebrate the fact that when the project was completed, Washington would be able to celebrate a third great figure who's contributed to American national life. The Evening Star newspaper editorializes as follows, quote, "The Folger Shakespeare Library fittingly takes place among other symbols, those other symbols that venerate America's immortals, the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial." Just to the 21st century reader, it really seems outlandish to pair an English poet with the first president of the United States and the president who held the Union together. What were they thinking when they thought all of those figures belonged on a line and should all be visited in Washington? I think that equation really depends on a view of civic life that places literature and Shakespeare directly in the line of the traditions that all must pass through in successive generations as citizens, much as the US Constitution or the body of common laws gets passed down. It's clear that in the late 20s and the early 30s, Washingtonians were beginning to glimpse a future era in which collections of art and artifacts, as well as the institutions of learning, would become a defining feature of life in the capital. So the creation of the Folger Shakespeare Library and Museum infrastructure really is mirroring something that is happening across the city. The first collection to arrive in Washington, D.C. was Thomas Jefferson's library, and it's now housed in the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress. But if you look from that moment forward, it was very slow the way in which collections started to arrive. In 1932, when the Folger opened, there was the Smithsonian Castle, the Freer, the Corcoran, but really not a lot else. I think one of the things then that this particular moment represents was the time in which Americans started to see the business of transacting democracy, which happens through words, especially in places like the floor of the Congress and the Supreme Court. They connected that to documents, libraries, and collections that would illustrate the range of knowledge and the history of the United States. This really was an ambition to make the capital city a city of learning, research, and culture. So, on the one hand, the placement of Shakespeare among the other monuments to Americans in American civic life suggests a belief in some kind of common fund of knowledge and experiences that benefit citizens in a participatory democracy. The linkage between Shakespeare's works and the business of government, a business that is conducted in words and in speeches, makes sense in light of the 19th century's almost wholesale adoption of Shakespeare as an artist for post-aristocratic society. Not only were there plenty of moving speeches in Shakespeare, so friends, Romans, countrymen, the plays offered many, many examples of monarchs and aristocrats behaving badly, and thus, I think, extolled the virtues of a mixed government in which individual and institutional ambitions are checked. So a morally good king like Richard II proves ineffective when he meets a Bolingbroke. Skilled liars such as Richard III thrive for a while and then fail. And the constant tug of war among aristocrats was showing Americans that power is often greedily acquired, reluctantly relinquished, and always up for grabs. In the 19th century, the poet Walt Whitman would comment on the obviously self-serving drives of the English aristocracy in an essay that he wrote which exists in manuscript at the Folger, called, quote, "What Lurks Behind Shakespeare's Historical Plays." And in this essay, Whitman argues that these plays witness, quote, "the inauguration of modern democracy," unquote, by chronicling the morbid accumulations of medieval history. So taken alongside these other readings of Shakespeare, which are taken as a warning, we can see how in the 18th and 19th century, Americans would have found their skepticism about earlier forms of government confirmed. There's an old formula from antiquity which says that there are three types of government: government by the one, the few, and the many. And this corresponds with monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. Those debates often talked about how each of those forms of government either succeed or fail in certain ways. A democracy, for example, is prone to failure because the masses and the many can often be finagled and seduced by a demagogue. Also, government by the few, aristocrats. Just look at a Shakespeare play and look at all of that infighting and undermining, and you have a recipe for disaster. There's actually a history of thinking about how these particular branches of government go together, and its history also starts in the Renaissance. And in a wonderful book by the historian John Pocock called The Machiavellian Moment, he describes the way in which the Republic of the Italian Renaissance, the city-states like Florence and Venice, represented an important departure from the medieval theory of government in which government was given by God. And the model for that government is the city of God in Augustine. But the insight that the Republican theorists had, first in the Italian Renaissance, then in a Republican movement in the English Civil War in the 17th century, and then again in the American founding and Revolution, was that republics die. And that fact, the mortalism of the Republic, then led to a series of statements and thoughts about the fact that to hold it together, you will actually then need something like civic virtue among equals that is exercised in participation. And that is a recipe that then continues into America. But I think the important thing to take away from this tradition, which I do think is called the Atlantic Republican tradition, is important, is that the idea that individuals under government can be both free and equal is one that will continue to animate political discussion, both in Europe and in the Americas. Really, though, there's disagreement about what those words mean, and there's still disagreement about what the words free and equal mean. I think there are two ways in which you could say that Shakespeare contributes to a culture of mixed government, that is, of the one, the few, and the many all at once, which was the model that was built for American democracy: the president, the upper house of the Senate, and the more representative house of the Congress. They all exist to check one another, and in effect are built upon the insight that human beings are self-corrupting and that that will be the end of a participatory republic. So the first way of linking Shakespeare to that particular tradition, I think, is one that is expansive. And I'm going to begin with that one. But a second one is restrictive. And each, I think, represents a different conviction about what both an American is and about what those important words meant. So the expansive argument cultivates the human capacity for what we could call living in attachment with others, something that depends not just on shared values and perceptions, but on a common fund of stories that serve as warnings or moral guides for the active citizen. And this could be as true for rulers and leaders, but it's also true in personal life. You know, if you've ever read Othello, one of the things you can take away from that play at any age is that someday you will meet your Iago. You know, everybody's going to meet that person who can tell them the lies that you just can't resist. And the question in a life is, what will you do when you meet that person? But this type of question is prompted by the plays, and there's a general, I think, wisdom literature tradition around thinking of plays as posing those questions and providing some of those answers. This particular view of civic life, I think, is the capacity to be progressive inasmuch as it believes that plays, literature, poetry speak most to American anxieties when they show exactly how people become unequal and unfree. And if everyone can be spoken to and about in this way, it must be their common humanity rather than some special positive legal status as citizens or some other birthright that qualifies them for life in a democracy. A related set of ideas is articulated in the 19th century by Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose lecture at Amherst College was what got the ball rolling with Henry. So Henry Folger received a copy of Shakespeare when he was 18, and he decided to annotate its contents. And one of the great things about the Folger collection, and this is an item in the collection, is that it is heavily annotated, and we're always looking for people's reactions to what they were reading. And Folger chose to excerpt passages from Emerson's Representative Men, including one of the most famous ones, which reads, "He drew the man of England and Europe, the father of the man in America. He drew the man and described the day and what is done in it. He could divide the mother's part from the father's part in the face of a child, or draw the fine demarcations of freedom and of fate." It's just a startling quotation in which Emerson is saying that just as someone could perceive the two parents in a single face, Shakespeare was able to, in a very fine way, understand what part of a life is the product of one's freedoms and what part of your life is a product of arbitrary fate and chance. Basic question. As Shakespeare scholar Michael Bristol has argued, Emerson offered a theory of Shakespeare's greatness that was particularly suited to the American landscape. For Emerson, Shakespeare's great gift was his untimeliness, his ability to anticipate the future by identifying almost anonymously with collective experience of those around him. In the composition of such works, Emerson says about Shakespeare, it's the time that thinks. The market thinks, the mason, the carpenter, the merchant, the farmer, the fop, all think for us. So the free individual, we might say, is free to converse with other individuals and even multiplicities like the market, because all are part of the same basic unit of collective reality, which he calls capaciously the times. That freedom of thought and capacity for discernment, which is passed down from one generation to the next, is what Emerson saw traced in the story arcs of so many characters. That vision transforms literature and letters into a conduit for perceptions that no concrete individual could ever have. And the civic addendum to this view, the one that seems to have excited Washington in the late 20s, is that literature itself represents a powerful set of perceptions that are essential to informed government. These perceptions become part of public life and public memory when they are physically added to the Capitol and memorialized within it. So the placement of the Folger Shakespeare Library in the cultural geography of Washington, I think, is part of this Emersonian idealistic position. And it's worth quoting at length a statement from the Evening Star, which was a Washington paper in 1929. I will show you this picture of the Folger on a postcard from the early 30s. So here's what the Evening Star says. Aside from the mere physical addition of this property in priceless books, the ideal philosophy behind the location of this library is its most sensational quality. To the front of the Folgers Memorial will be the Capitol building and the new Supreme Court, while flanking it on every side will be the old and new libraries of Congress. So that here, in the shadow of the nation's legislative and judicial halls, Will Shakespeare, poet, actor, and dramatist, shall hold forth. Since when has this become a cardinal principle of American life? Since when has Congress changed the reading of a bill in order to provide for a mere poet? It is only in the present. Now the national legislature begins to take cognizance of edifices whose only purpose is the worship of an ideal, whose earnings and profits can never be calculated in gold because the commodity on tap is mere admiration, and that is dispensed for free. The Evening Star writer goes on to conclude, this development will mark the substantial nucleus of a center of learning that has no counterpart in the Western world and but feeble manifestation in the Old World. No matter what the quest, the search will end at Capitol Hill. Even among the breathless testimonials that greeted the new library in the 20s, I think this is an extraordinary set of claims for the value of poetry, literature, and learning in the context of liberal government. Washington is not simply invited to celebrate a new way of accessing widely enjoyed stories. This could happen just by putting the plays in your front parlor. The promise of the Folger's addition to the furnishings of government is the promise that poetry, literature, and history are to be studied, and that the Capitol complex has come to be inevitably seen as a center of learning. I don't think I've seen a more ambitious statement of the importance of the humanities and the arts to democracy. It's something we need to repeat to the Congress as they authorize NEH and NEA. When I repeat these claims about Washington becoming a center of learning outside of Washington, people usually laugh because there are two perceptions about Washington that I think are at odds with that ambition. The first is something that I hear regularly from audiences who are on the right, who see the addition of academic learning to Capitol life as a bug rather than a feature. So you may remember William F. Buckley's comment, I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the telephone book than by the faculty of Harvard University. So that's the suspicion of expertise. But there's also a suspicion, I think, on the left, which is one about a culture in which emulation of models becomes a form of attachment between citizens who experience some form of life in association. I think, after ideology critique and maybe after the 60s and 70s, this starts to feel a little bit naive. There's another reason why this is not attractive. So the equation of Shakespeare with the cultivation of civic virtue is hard to defend, not just because it's old-fashioned or it's abstract, but because that very linkage has been tied to an ideology of racial or cultural purity that is itself part of the story of civic Shakespeare, one that represents a restrictive view of the relationship of Shakespeare to civic life. A key episode in that history is also tied to the events in Washington on April 23, 1932. When the press came to cover the opening of the Folger Shakespeare Library, the President and Mrs. Taft were seated in the theater, and the opening ceremony began with a reading of a message from King George V. The commemorative lecture, entitled Shakespeare and American Culture, was to be delivered by then Director of Research Joseph Quincy Adams, a former professor from Cornell who the newspaper described as one of the greatest living authorities on Shakespearean drama. While he was no relation to the presidential Adams family, Joseph Quincy Adams used his address to advance a very different vision of civic Shakespeare from the one we've just been discussing. In his remarks, Adams claimed that Shakespeare belonged to America because he represented an Anglo-Saxon culture whose language and culture needed to be protected in an age of increased immigration. In language that could be adopted verbatim by today's anti-immigration activists, Adams lays out a theory known as the Anglo-Saxon myth that had been popularized by 19th century intellectuals and brought into government circles by Massachusetts Senator and Harvard PhD Henry Cabot Lodge. That myth held that Teutonic peoples from Northern Europe, constituting a distinct biological race and language group, carried a culture of individual freedom and respect for private property north to England after fleeing their original forest homes. In the American version of this myth, the Northern European import then thrived in England only for a time after the Norman conquest, but it was progressively corrupted, allowing only its purest strain to survive as an Anglo-Saxon people moved to America. From the perspective of this now discredited but persistent racist argument, the advance of a supposedly homogeneous Anglo-Saxon culture helped explain the success of American government and society, a success that in the 1880s and 1890s was then perceived to be under threat by the arrival of Eastern and Southern Europeans. Significantly, prior to that wave of immigration, the groups that came before, which was the Irish, the German, and the Scandinavians, were also criticized as outsiders. If, Adams argues, out of America, unwieldy in size and commonly called the melting pot of the races, there has been evolved a homogeneous nation with a culture that is still essentially English, we must acknowledge that that in that process, Shakespeare played a major part. He concludes his formal oration by quoting Thomas Carlyle's remarks on King Shakespeare, saying, "Yes, this Shakespeare is ours. We produced him. We speak and think by him. We are one blood and kind with him." Here, then, is the restrictive Civic Shakespeare, a character and a myth that mistakes continuity in language and institutions for racial inheritance. The arguments Adams was making in 1932 were already well out of date. The Anglo-Saxon myth peaked in the 1880s and 1890s, and it found its high point in public consciousness when Congress debated the racially restrictive immigration quotas that were passed into law in 1921 and 1924. Adams must have repeated them because he liked them, or perhaps because he felt the occasion demanded a narrative like the Aeneid, one that told the story of the founding of a dynasty. His sentiments are at odds with the Emersonian ones that so inspired Henry Folger, and I suspect and I hope that had Folger lived to deliver the opening oration himself, he would have chosen to present the twin legacies of Shakespeare and civic life in very different terms. We cannot answer that what-if question. The Emersonian legacy is important, though, because it stresses the power of Shakespeare's words to speak to a crowded world, from merchant to farmer, partisan to fop, really all the 19th century world with its brutal conflicts around slavery and race, which Emerson saw in John Brown's Armed Revolt, and its reconfiguration of nature and spirituality, which Emerson also encouraged. Our times are different. In the 21st century, American liberal democracy encompasses the voices of immigrants and activists, globalists and localists, somewheres and anywheres, and even algorithms in the place of markets. More specifically, it includes the voices of native peoples, immigrants and people of color who remain key figures in the very American story of the fight for equal participation or simply equal recognition in American civic life. These changes raise basic questions about how and whether the continued study of Shakespeare contributes to the creation and maintenance of a just, free, and equitable society. If we agree on these ideals, we should also then have a sense, given the expansive and restrictive history of civic Shakespeare, of why this writer speaks not just to those values, but to the unequal awareness of the fact that we are still unequal. I phrase this last point in terms of perception because I think that our current impasse, our trouble with association and living in attachment with each other, is not just a policy program thrown up by the pressing and real fact that legal, economic, and educational freedoms are enjoyed unequally. Now, this is clearly a problem, but it's not one that Shakespeare in literature can help with directly. There's a second problem, though, that is more entrenched, and it has to do with an asymmetry of perception, with the fact that in addition to these material inequities, there is also an unequal recognition of the freedoms that are distributed unequally, including the freedom to discuss perceptions of those inequities. When that perception and those recognitions are not shared, the experiences we're trying to come to grips with in civic life and culture more generally, experiences of exclusion, rivalry, invisibility, are impossible to discuss or share since they depend on just that shared awareness. Our conversations about race in America are just one of these examples, and I'd like to end with a couple of examples of how this impasse is being navigated, not just within Shakespeare studies, but within the ways in which we think about Shakespeare's role in society. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. There is Joseph Quincy Adams on the right. A very important thing happened to me as director of the Folger when I encountered a play that did play here in Boston called American Moor. And this play, which was written by the actor Keith Hamilton Cobb, is the story of an African-American actor who is auditioning for the role of Othello for a director who is very clearly a white Midwestern middle-aged man. And in the course of this really brutal but deeply perceptive play, a very important question is raised, and it connects to the discussion that we've just been having, which is it possible, or is it sometimes impossible, for someone to empathize with the plight of another person whose experiences are so very different? And what the play demonstrates in this back and forth between the director and the actor is the fact that the director repeatedly fails to even be able to think about the fact that it is ridiculous for him to be directing and lecturing this African-American actor on what his masculinity is in a racist society. This play, when it lands with audiences, immediately begins important conversations about how empathy works or fails to work, not just in the theater, because people are sympathizing, and these sympathies often play out along racial lines, but not always, how people are either sympathizing or failing to sympathize with this main character. I recommend this play to you. It's just been an off-Broadway, and if and when it does return to Boston, I actually hope it comes to Boston College, because it's really an engine for important conversations. We chose to actually acquire the script to this play and all the iterations of it, because as we think forward 100 years to people who are going to be trying to understand this cultural moment that we live in, one way to try to do that is to look at journalism, to look at tweets, to look at diaries. But sometimes it's really, really important to have a work of art that helps you see around the corners of the things that you can't experience. And I do think that this play will be one of the places that people go when they ask themselves, what was really happening in the turn of the 21st century? I also wanted to point out some important conversations that are happening within academia. A series of conversations about Shakespeare and race have been happening, both in the context of what we would call the practical humanities, and that is, how can plays and conversations about plays get us into conversations that not only are productive, but allow Americans to talk about the things they can't see and can't experience? And I think this really gets to the problem that Keith Cobb's play demonstrates, which is it's not just that we arrive in the theater with different experiences and with different abilities to act on the freedoms that we either have and we don't have. Those inequities cannot be repaired in the theater. But the theater offers the opportunity for something like a democracy of perception. The ability to grasp as an immediate fact before you, with a human being in front of you, that there are plights that we simply must understand or acknowledge that we do not. And I think a lot hinges, not just on whether Shakespeare remains relevant, but whether novels and poems and films remain capable of transforming our discussions of our attachment with others. A lot depends on whether you agree with or disagree with this possibility that on some level we could arrive in a room and see the same thing. not interpret it, but just see as a fact, a human being is in need, a human being is making a claim on me. Maybe art, maybe theater can help us see that. And in these conversations that have been happening in academic contexts, at Arizona State University, Lafayette College, one has happened at the Folger, I think that question is playing out, and we want to understand the answers to that question because it is my hope that the next 100 years of Civic Shakespeare represent an inclusive and expansive vision of our life together that is what Joseph Quincy Adams most feared. That is the job for a public institution that represents a writer who is claimed to represent the experiences of so many people. Two more examples. This is what's known as an API. It's a mini application that sits on top of a text repository at the Folger. And on the left, this is the text of the Folger Shakespeare editions, which we've put up online for free as the digital texts. So there were 2 million page views of these texts last year. And what we figured out is, because it is the most deeply encoded, I think, literary text in the world, I mean, you can chunk it out and do things with it in pieces and in wholes. It's then possible to ask a translator, and in this case, his name is Alfredo Michel Modenese, to create a Spanish edition, a translation that maps exactly speech for speech, line beginning and line ending, onto the English text. And that then creates an interesting condition of reversibility. Everything that is said in English can then be flipped into an annotation on a base Spanish text, and vice versa. But one of the things that I think comes out in this kind of idea of parallel texts is that the conversations around Shakespeare, which are already taking place in so many different languages, are going to include more people and more perspectives. A final example. This one is, I think, hard to interpret, so I'm just going to pause and tell you what this is a picture of. So this picture is derived from something called a word embedding model. A word embedding model is created with machine learning, and what it does is, in this case, it takes over 1,000 plays from the English Renaissance. And because those words are written in order and transcribed in order, first thing the algorithm does is turn them into one very, very, very long sentence. It just arranges them in order. And then the next thing it does is it randomly samples 8 word sequences and asks itself, when I see this word, do I also see this other word? And how often does that happen? So now you can imagine a very large table starting to fill up with correspondences. That then gets expressed as what you could think of as a cloud of words. And because certain words go together, because millions and millions and millions of times this data has been sampled, you start to see not just that similar words go together. So for example, if I query the model and I say, show me the place where dogs, cats, and foxes live, the first answer will be other animals. And you can imagine why, because these animals tend to co-occur with each other in descriptions of nature. However, those items are also arrayed along dimensions that we would now recognize as corresponding to gender, religious confession, race, and nationality. So what that means is that if I go into this model and say, show me 20 animals that occur in this corpus, and these are just animals that are occurring in the plays that surround Shakespeare's work, now show them to me along 2 axes. The x-axis, left and right, will be Christian associations, literally associated with the word Christian, Christ, and non-Christian. So the place in the model that's measured from over there is pagan, heathen. If you draw a line between those 2 points in the space, these very nouny things, animals, will spread out according to how they're associated. Second axis is easier, he and she. So one of the things we're learning as we start to sample through not just millions of words, but billions of words that were generated between 1470 and roughly 1800, is that there are patterns of association around words that go beyond the literal referent of what you're talking about, but that really scatter even the names of animals into associations that are connected with, in this case, religion and gender. Now, that's important first because poets manipulate those associations. That is often what poets are doing, consciously or unconsciously. And the what that they are manipulating is, I think, what we would now call something like implicit bias. That is an unconscious spreading of certain words into associations that we either do or don't recognize. So I show you this picture, which is something that people, researchers, and sometimes Folger readers are interacting with, because if you look at a play like Othello, a play that deals with a Moorish general who is married a Venetian woman and who then becomes convinced that she's cheating on him with another Venetian, the kind of sexual language that is generated in that play is often animalistic. And scholars have been talking about that for a long time. But here in this picture, what we can see is that when Shakespeare or Iago says goats and monkeys, which is a way of suggesting to Othello that these two individuals are like animals, the people that Othello is supposed to fantasize about as cheating on him, there are associations with those words that map exactly onto the ways in which people are using them over and over and over again. So what I think we will learn, in addition to the questions we've been asking about community, about the records of who speaks and how their voices are heard, is a deeper sense of just how unconscious and diffuse the understandings of who does what and how are in a society, and that this happens over and over again at the level of the words. I want to stop at that fourth example and say in conclusion that as I think about 1932 and recognize that people who have incredible powers of perception and thinking and even mastery of historical detail are nevertheless sometimes blind. I think about Joseph Quincy Adams thinking that he knew what Shakespeare would become in the next 100 years and why Shakespeare was important to civic life. And if you've ever read a Shakespearean play or seen it performed, you know that the prophecies in Act 1 end up going the other way in Act 5. And it is my hope that we prove him wrong, not just historically, but in the ways in which we live with each other and talk with each other, but also that the limits that we have in our abilities to understand not just our connection, but our histories, are ones that we will hand over and record to the next generations who will ask probably hard questions about us. Thanks very much for listening tonight.
I was noticing the headline of that newspaper article that says America's great national library sets the pace for world something.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the strain of nationalism that goes through this, and even in the Folger's project and other people in that period, their project of collecting things from Britain and bringing them to America as some sort of transmission of something.
I think it's both transmission and knowing collectors. It is also about acquiring trophies that then reflect on the owner. So you have Henry Huntington on the West Coast bidding for Shakespeare items, sometimes beating out Mr. Folger by getting there first. You have the Newberry collection that's now in Chicago, and then the Library of Congress, which grows up out of Jefferson's collection. I think the National Library is its own almost governmental incarnation. But if you want to talk about the cultural forces at work, there's an insecurity in the 19th century that America has no culture, it has no traditions. And strangely enough, Shakespeare seems to be able to fill that gap because he's just as strange to us as he now is to people in England. And it's fascinating to me to see these remarks by, for example, Henry Cabot Lodge, who go on to claim that Shakespeare's English survives in a purer form in North America because England has moved along and they've forgotten the words that Shakespeare used. So that kind of nationalist argument is really about one-upping England about their being English. And there's just an intense competitiveness around that. And then there's also temples and buildings that look like this that then celebrate an almost sacred space that's been created out of these objects that are treated as relics. Unlike the Middle Ages, they don't stage the stealing of their objects and try and get them back, which was a way of increasing their value. But there's just huge competitiveness about it.
I just have a question. You mentioned that you looked across the street and you could see the Senate and the House, and I wondered what your relationship is to them, and if you yourself do lobbying for your foundation.
So I lobby for the humanities. I've testified before the Interior Committee on the importance of funding the NEH and something called the IMLS, which funds libraries. The Folger does occupy a quasi-government. We don't get federal money. You know, we're the product of philanthropy, but we do have a stake in the success of national humanities funding. And you know, it is very interesting to be in that space because we're unaligned, and most often academic institutions lean left, and there are a lot of assumptions about what everyone thinks and what they want to do. But I regularly encounter people coming across the street from the Heritage Foundation, which leans very right, who have a deep passion for history and literature. So just to give you a personal example, I remember a senator coming to look at a book whose politics I probably disagree with in every possible way, but who just started reciting Milton and Shakespeare and Emily Dickinson because where he grew up, his father said those words to him. And you know, you could just see this deep, passionate attachment, not just to literature, but to the humanities. And so, I'm not exactly answering your question, but I do think it's important that when members of Congress come over, or we have Supreme Court justices who come over, at one point the 18 female senators came over and they often eat together. They sat in front of a portrait of Elizabeth I and looked at documents, or heard handwritten documents, and talked about female leadership. You know, for me, that's a vivid example of the leadership of the country coming together and having really important discussions about history. And so I do lobby actively because I'm a humanist and I can talk to the federal government sometimes. But I think it's even more important indirectly to demonstrate to people who both agree with us and people who might not sympathize with an academic institution that there is a value here. And I think it's hugely important that the Folger is unaligned and that Shakespeare did not take sides.
I was just wondering sort of the line that the Folger has to walk where you know, you're venerating Shakespeare but also having to be critical of Shakespeare, and how that's maybe changed over the course of the Folger from 1932 to now.
Well, that's a really good question. I think you saw me just trying to walk it. I think I'm probably the first director to directly confront the things that Joseph Quincy Adams said. And I do that because I think it's important to understand how we got to where we are. I also disagree with that particular vision of why this writer speaks to all of us. But I also think that it's not our job just to praise Shakespeare. You know, there are things that Shakespeare put in his plays and talked about. I mean, the period in which he wrote was a period of rampant anti-Semitism, misogyny, religious intolerance, and there are things that are said and done in those plays that should not be said or done in civil society. And so as interpreters of these plays for the public or for artists, it's really important to acknowledge both sides of that. But I would not go so far as to say these plays are so problematic, so dated, so narrow, so Eurocentric that they have nothing to offer us anymore. I think that's wrong. And I think it's specifically about some of the things Shakespeare was good at. He was really good at showing people at moments when they change their mind or when they recognize something, including injustice and inequity. He's just really good at that. He's also really good at showing how things go wrong in government with kings and aristocrats. So that ability to take multiple sides and then to show them to people, I think that's still essential. So the line when I try to walk it is one that is historically aware, but there is also a certain kind of advocacy because the collection and the surrounding literature exists, and it's our obligation not just to say why that's interesting and important, but then how the significance of all of that is changing as Shakespeare is just taken over by people. We sent a first folio to 50 states and 2 territories in 2016. It was the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. And just one of the things that struck me was when it was in Dakota, the institution that hosted it translated the to be or not to be speech, which it was open to, into the Lakota language. And the translator said, you know, this is very interesting because I don't have a verb for the word to be. But then when the book went to Hawaii and they were translating it into Hawaiian, the translator said, actually, I have 10 choices. So it was a really good example of how not just people are interested in those words, but how they really want to take them over, and then how those words must change as they arrive in other languages. So that's a metaphor for me of how all of this gets taken over.
Being sort of the director of this sort of national institution, and you talked about the role of public education and how important sort of the Folger stands for not just Shakespeare, but, you know, literature and poetry and its role in politics. Do you feel limited in some sense by the fact that it is the Folger Shakespeare Memorial Library, or do you feel like that in some way, to what extent do you feel your role is really this larger connection between theater generally and politics versus having to stay specifically as an advocate for Shakespeare?
I think the mission is broader. I think we would take the kind of encyclopedic nature of Shakespeare, that fact that he does touch on a lot of parts of life, and then ask the question, what other artists, what other books, what other writers have that same sense of kind of trying to hold tight a multitude and doing it with beautiful words? So that's part of it. But there was a debate at the Folger because the word Shakespeare, which is the middle name, was much larger than any of the other words on the front of the building. And the collection has, I mean, it's everything from dog hunting manuals to business records to Italian horse breeding. I mean, just everything, science, literature, religion, ephemera. And there was a period where we talked a lot about the fact that we're not just Shakespeare. I think it's a good idea to start with Shakespeare. 90% of American school kids will encounter Shakespeare at least once before they're 18. It is the only author mentioned in the Common Core standards, the only one. It's actually a very American thing. Could have done that in the 19th century. But there's something about the shared nature of the stories that is a great starting point for branching off into other things. And so I feel it would be a mistake not to emphasize Shakespeare, and we're about to add some new galleries and really show our collection, and we'll be shut probably from April to summer of 2022, adding about 5,000 square feet of light, secure gallery space. But then we'll show all 82 first folios as a collection. And we'll show Walt Whitman's copy of the sonnets that he carried in his pocket, or George Eliot's notebook where she recorded the lines from Shakespeare that she wanted to have as the headers in Middlemarch, or the Paul Robeson script that showed how it was performed in London, Othello was performed in London, you know. We would like to show all of that and tell the story of how the world became modern. You know, in the 2 centuries when Shakespeare was alive, the big pieces of the world we still live in, so science, international trade, colonization, corporations, insurance, secular theater, media revolution in the form of the printing press, religious intolerance, all of that gets going, 16th and 17th century. In a city like Washington, you know, history really, with the exception of only a few museums, history starts in 1776. And, you know, if you start at Magna Carta and you go to the Declaration of Independence, a lot happened between those two things. And I think that our collection is one of the few places where we could tell that story. And we need it. We need a prologue like that. Not because English history is the great mythical inheritance of all Americans. I mean, people can ignore it or not care about it. But the more you know about what people thought and did in that period, the more you can spot, you know, oh, this particular problem we're having here, it started in the early 17th century. You know, and knowing where it came from does give you a certain kind of freedom. But you can walk through that door starting with Shakespeare, because he touched on a lot of those different things.
What is your outreach to young kids, either in the public schools of DC or in, you know, other groups, but to young children?
Yes. So the Folger has trained 25,000 high school English teachers in performance and document-based education in Shakespeare. So that means instead of sitting at a desk reading the words, you and I get out of our seats and we look at each other and we speak the lines. And even if we don't comprehend 80% of them, just the sheer fact of looking someone else in the eye and saying, well, how is that person feeling right now? Oh, that explains what this word means. It allows young people to, you know, just put the pieces together in a more organic way. We also just took over professional development for all teachers of Shakespeare in the DC public school system, which is a natural extension of this experience with supporting teachers. And it is my hope that in these new galleries that we create, there is a wide, wide lane where every kid in DC who's reading Romeo and Juliet or Othello can see a 400-year-old book and can touch 400-year-old paper, or can mix ink and take a quill and cut it and learn about that handwriting. But it's very important for, I think, young people to touch things. And zoos do a great job of it. I'm not saying there's going to be a petting zoo for early Shakespeare, but you should be able to have the experience of touching 400-year-old paper, because it survives. It's made out of shirts and clothing that was pulped up, and gosh, you know, this feels like a media revolution right here. But when you think about what the printing press did, we might still just be catching up. And that was because people could make these objects. So it's my hope that we succeed with teachers in supporting them in the classroom, because if 90% of American school kids, this is their first encounter with theater, poetry, and history, you really want that to be great. It wasn't really great for me the first time around, but I survived. You know, but we want to make that great. But there's another story, I think, about the fact that we can touch the past and that real people lived the experiences and we have recorded them in these fragile objects that are kind of heroic. They also survive, that those things are real, and want to put that all together.
I was very curious about the use of digital resources for researching Shakespeare generally. Yeah. What do you think are the major advantages and generally disadvantages? Obviously, this has revealed new truths about Shakespeare, new things that we hadn't considered. Do you think, are there concerns that you have about using, digital things to research Shakespeare?
Well, so that was the other lecture I had thought about giving tonight, but I'll give you a short answer to that. When I taught at Carnegie Mellon for 9 years, I was working in an environment where the ambient level of computational thinking was really, really high, and math was the first language. So when I would say I'm a professor in the English department, my colleagues would say, "Oh, you teach grammar." And my answer was, yes, I do. That's really important. But there's this thing called interpretation that's not about making stuff. It's about figuring out what it means. And that's our particular skill. As I started to learn more about data science and started counting things, these could be single words, they could be phrases, and discovering patterns there, what I discovered was those patterns almost always correspond to a perception that a human being has had. With this incredible research instrument we have right here, when you read a text, you are making millions and millions of comparisons. And it just gives you this sense, oh, this is really funny and light, it's a comedy. Now, Hemmings and Condell, who published the first folio, published a catalog page, and they drew circles around the 36 plays, which a data scientist will say, oh, it's labeled data from a domain expert. Great. And then it becomes a machine learning problem. What's interesting about that is that you need a humanist to explain why the pattern that was found in the text is a proxy for this really complicated word that we use in conversation like comedy. That is a label that contains a lot of data. And whenever a person who's read a lot of books applies that to something, there's a huge amount of information that's thrown off. So the first reaction I have to your question is, I'm not worried about humanists. I've met statisticians who've said to me, literally said to me, I have created statistics that help me talk about climatology, oceans, astronomy, pause. But texts are the most complicated multivariate object I have ever encountered. Just come on over to our side of the quad. That's really important. There are things you can discover this way. They tend to be about what authors do over and over again and that we never pay attention to. So they're very good algorithms for just counting words like if, and, but, for, the, two grammar words, for showing which scenes Shakespeare wrote or didn't write. And those techniques have been used to identify Marlowe as the author of one of the two scenes in 2 Henry VI. But there are also techniques that allow us to figure out how Shakespeare created certain techniques for storytelling with 12 people in 2 hours with no flashbacks. There's just certain things you can't not do, and we never would have recognized them unless someone forced us to kind of look at the footwork, and that's new knowledge. So, second point. Third point, if you go into a library and you look at the book you want to read, you ask yourself, what's next to it? If it's shelved according to the Library of Congress system, the books next to it will be related by subject because a human being applied a label. Okay? That takes a lot of work, but it's really, really important. The advantage of having a model of all the books at once that are built on the words inside them is that you can now rearrange that bookshelf an infinite number of times based on what you are looking for or what you think you're looking for. And it's that dynamic movement among types of books that is starting to change how we read and which texts we read. So I think that will change some of the perceptions we have from this period.
Michael, before I ask you to join me and thank you, Michael Witmore, once more, I'd remind you that there are copies at the BC bookstore table right outside the door. I'd also remind you that a week from tomorrow night, Thursday, not Wednesday, Carl Hart is here speaking as part of the Lowell, so you're welcome back to that as well. And finally, I just remind you to please little survey card, and there is a box on the bookstore table that you can deposit them in, or you can hand them to either Chandler or Kelsey or myself. Again, just ask you to thank Michael Witmore for a fascinating talk.